My name is Imogen Clark. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in offices where people assumed they understood me within the first week. The quiet one, the reliable one, the one who never caused problems. I live in Bristol, England, and for the past 7 years, I worked in a mid-sized consulting firm where efficiency was valued, confidence was rewarded, and silence was usually interpreted as agreement. If you met me in a meeting room back then, you probably wouldn't remember me afterwards. I rarely raised my voice. I didn't interrupt people. I didn't compete for attention. I took notes, delivered my work on time, and asked careful questions when something didn't quite make sense. Most people assumed that meant I lacked ambition. Some assumed I lacked backbone. And a few, especially those higher up the ladder, assumed something even more convenient, that I would always stay exactly where they placed me. For a long time, I let them believe that. Not because I was naive, not because I was weak, but because I had learned something very early in my career. When people underestimate you, they reveal far more than they intend. The story I'm about to tell didn't begin with shouting or betrayal or a dramatic moment in a boardroom. It began with something smaller, quieter, almost forgettable. My manager told everyone I was quitting next month. The rumor spread through the office in a single afternoon. The strange part was that no one had asked me if it was true. Not my colleagues, not HR, not even the people who had worked beside me for years. They simply adjusted their behavior, the way people do when they believe someone is already halfway out the door. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. Then I realized something more uncomfortable. The rumor was useful to someone. And once you understand who benefits from a story, you begin to understand why it exists. What followed over the next several weeks wasn't dramatic in the way movies like to portray conflict. There were no shouting matches, no emotional confrontations, no triumphant speeches. Instead, it unfolded through quiet observations, careful decisions, and a series of small actions that most people didn't notice until it was far too late to undo them. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about clarity, about the moment you realize the role other people have written for you and the quiet power of deciding not to perform it anymore. And by the time the truth finally surfaced, the people who had been most certain about my future were the ones who understood it the least. But before I explain how any of that happened, you need to understand something first. You need to understand who I was to them, and maybe more importantly, why they were so comfortable believing I would disappear quietly. Before we go further, let me ask you something. Have you ever discovered that people had already decided who you were without ever asking you? If you had asked anyone in the office to describe me back then, the answers would have sounded remarkably similar. Imogen? Oh, she's very dependable. Quiet but good at what she does. She's been here forever, hasn't she? None of those descriptions was untrue, but none of them were complete either. I joined the firm 7 years earlier, fresh from a smaller consultancy, where I had spent most of my time doing work that other people preferred not to think about. Operational processes, reporting systems, project coordination, the invisible infrastructure of a company. The kind of work that only becomes visible when it stops functioning. In the beginning, I didn't mind being behind the scenes. I actually preferred it. While other people chased visibility and promotions, I was more interested in understanding how things actually worked. Who made decisions? Who influenced those decisions? And which conversations mattered long before they appeared in official meetings. That habit made me very good at my job. Within 2 years, I knew more about the firm's internal operations than most department heads. Not because I had been formally told anything, but because I noticed patterns. The way deadlines moved when certain clients were involved. The quiet reshuffling of responsibilities after a senior partner made a mistake. The subtle difference between what people said in meetings and what they meant afterward. But none of that knowledge came with a title. On paper, I was simply a senior operations coordinator, which translated into everyday office language meant something closer to the person who quietly fixes things before anyone notices they were broken. When a client report was missing data, I fixed it. When a project timeline suddenly didn't make sense, I reorganized it. When two departments were misunderstanding each other, I quietly translated expectations between them. And because I rarely made a spectacle of solving those problems, most people assumed the problems had never existed in the first place. That was the strange paradox of invisible work. The better you are at it, the less visible you become. Over time, that invisibility hardened into a kind of identity. In meetings, people often spoke over me without realizing it. Not intentionally, more like a habit formed over the years. Someone louder would begin explaining a point I had just made. Someone more senior would summarize a solution I had suggested 10 minutes earlier. And because I didn't interrupt them to reclaim it, the room simply accepted the version that arrived with more confidence. At first, I found it frustrating. Then I found it informative. You learn a lot about people when you watch what they do with unearned credit. Some grow uncomfortable and redirect it. Most simply accept it. And a few begin to believe the story completely. My manager, Daniel Hartley, belonged to the third category. Daniel was charismatic in the way many mid-level managers are. Confident enough to sound decisive, careful enough to avoid obvious mistakes. When I joined the firm, he had been supportive. He praised my organization, relied on my preparation for client presentations, and occasionally introduced me to senior leadership as the person who keeps everything running. At the time, I thought he meant it as respect. Looking back, I think it was something else, a classification. In Daniel's mind, I had become a very specific type of employee, reliable, non-confrontational, and unlikely to challenge the narrative of how things worked, which meant he trusted me with more operational responsibility than anyone else in the department. But he also trusted something else, that I would never question the role he had quietly assigned me, the dependable background figure, the one who ensured everything functioned smoothly while others received the recognition. For years, that arrangement worked perfectly, for everyone except me. But the truth is, I didn't resent it the way people might expect. Because invisibility has an unusual side effect. When people stop paying attention to you, they also stop noticing what you're learning. And by the time Daniel told the entire office that I would be leaving next month, he had already forgotten one very important detail. I had been paying attention the entire time. The first moment that truly stayed with me didn't feel important at the time. In fact, if you had asked me that day whether anything unusual had happened, I probably would have said no. It was a Tuesday morning meeting, the kind that happens every week and leaves almost no memory behind. Our team gathered in the glass conference room on the fourth floor, laptops open, coffee cups balanced beside printed reports. Daniel stood at the front as usual, walking through updates for a large client project we had been managing for nearly 6 months. Most of the operational planning for that project had passed through my desk. Timelines, staffing rotations, and reporting structures. The framework that allowed the consultants to focus on the actual client work. It had taken weeks to build, mostly through small adjustments after noticing where the original plan didn't quite hold together. I didn't mind doing that kind of work quietly. It suited me. But that morning, something shifted in a way I couldn't quite name. Halfway through the meeting, one of the senior consultants raised a concern. The reporting deadlines still feel tight, he said. If the client asks for revisions, we're going to run out of time. The room went quiet for a moment. Everyone looked toward Daniel. Before he could respond, I spoke. Actually, the schedule accounts for that, I said calmly. There's a 2-day buffer between internal review and the client submission. If revisions happen, the extra time is already built in. I had designed it that way specifically to prevent this problem. Daniel glanced down at the printed timeline on the table. Then he nodded slowly. Right, he said. Then he turned back to the room. What we did, Daniel continued in, was add a buffer between internal review and client delivery so revisions wouldn't slow us down. The words themselves were almost identical to what I had just said, but something about the tone was different. He didn't look at me when he said it, and the room responded the way people always do when a manager speaks, with immediate acceptance. A few people nodded. Someone typed a note into their laptop. The meeting moved forward. No one seemed to notice the small shift in ownership, except me. For a moment, I considered saying something, not confrontational, just clarifying. Actually, that was my adjustment to the schedule. But the moment passed before I could decide. Daniel had already moved on to the next slide, and interrupting the flow would have made the correction feel larger than the original moment. So I stayed quiet. The meeting continued. When it ended, everyone stood up, gathered their laptops, and drifted back toward their desks. On the way out, one of the consultants patted Daniel lightly on the shoulder. Good thinking on that timeline, he said. That buffer will save us. Daniel smiled. Just trying to stay ahead of problems, he replied. I was walking behind them when I heard it. Neither of them realized I had been the one who built the timeline in the first place. And strangely, Daniel didn't correct the assumption. That was the part I remembered later. Not the meeting itself, not the credit, but the ease with which the misunderstanding was allowed to settle into place. As if the room had quietly agreed on a version of reality that made everything simpler. The manager proposes a solution. Team accepts it. Meeting moves on. I told myself it didn't matter. After all, I hadn't asked for recognition. And the plan itself was still being used exactly as intended. The work was functioning, which, in operations, is often the only outcome anyone cares about. Still, something about the moment stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it was dramatic, but because it revealed a pattern I hadn't fully seen before. Recognition wasn't always taken deliberately. Sometimes it simply drifted toward the person people already expected to receive it. And once that drift began, it became surprisingly easy for everyone in the room to accept it as the natural order of things, including the person who benefited from it. At the time, I brushed the thought aside. It was a small moment, barely noticeable, just a tiny adjustment in the story of how things worked in our department. But small adjustments have a way of accumulating, and over time, those little shifts begin to form something larger, something harder to ignore. After that meeting, nothing changed. At least nothing obvious. The project moved forward smoothly. The timeline worked exactly as I had designed it. Client revisions came in, the buffer absorbed them, and the final delivery happened without stress. From the outside, it looked like a well-managed operation, which meant Daniel received another quiet compliment from senior leadership about how organized our department had become. I heard about it a week later. Daniel's team has really tightened things up, one of the partners said in the hallway outside the break room. Projects have been running cleaner lately. Daniel thanked him with the comfortable smile of someone receiving praise he had come to expect. I was standing a few steps away from the coffee machine. He glanced at me briefly, not an acknowledgement, but the casual awareness people have when someone familiar is nearby. Then the conversation ended, and everyone returned to work. Moments like that began to appear more often. Not dramatic enough to be called a problem, just small adjustments in how the room interpreted reality. A client praised a report structure I had redesigned. Daniel explained to them how our team had improved reporting clarity. In a planning session, I proposed reorganizing a workflow that had been slowing projects down. Later that week, Daniel presented the same structure in a leadership update. Again, he didn't claim the idea outright. He simply described the improvement as something the department had implemented under his management. And because that explanation fit everyone's expectations, no one questioned it. At first, I tried to interpret these moments generously. Management often summarizes team efforts. Ideas pass through multiple voices before they reach decision makers. Credit becomes collective. That's normal. But over time, I noticed something more specific. When someone else in the department contributed an idea, Daniel often named them directly. Sarah suggested this adjustment. James noticed that issue last week. Those acknowledgments were quick and casual, but they existed. With me, the pattern was different. My contributions became part of the background. They were described as improvements the team had made, or adjustments Daniel had decided on. Never intentionally dismissive, just absorbed. I told myself there was a practical explanation. Maybe Daniel assumed I didn't care about recognition. Maybe he thought I preferred working quietly. And in some ways, he wasn't wrong. I didn't enjoy competing for attention. I didn't interrupt people in meetings. I didn't chase visible wins the way some colleagues did. So I rationalized the pattern. It's easier this way. The work is still happening. The projects are succeeding. There's no real harm being done. But rationalizations have a strange side effect. They slowly train other people how to treat you. If you allow a small dismissal once, it becomes easier the second time. Then the third. Eventually, the behavior stops feeling like a decision at all. It simply becomes the shape of the relationship. That's what was happening between Daniel and me. Not through conflict, through repetition. A meeting where my suggestion became his summary. A project improvement is described as a managerial initiative. A compliment redirected without correction. None of these moments was large enough to challenge directly. Each one, on its own, seemed harmless. But taken together, they began to form a quiet narrative inside the department. Daniel was the strategist, the organizer, the person ensuring everything ran smoothly. And I was helpful, reliable, the quiet operational support behind the scenes. The strange thing is, I didn't resent Daniel the way someone might expect, because part of me understood exactly how the pattern had formed. He wasn't stealing credit in a dramatic sense, he was simply accepting the version of events that arrived most easily. And because I never corrected those small shifts, the story kept drifting in the same direction. Over time, people stopped connecting certain improvements with me at all. They simply appeared, as if they had always belonged to the department's leadership, which meant Daniel began to rely on something he probably didn't even realize, the assumption that I would always remain quiet, always remain cooperative, always remain exactly where I was. And when people build expectations like that, they begin to trust them. Trust that the structure will stay the same. Trust that the invisible work will continue without complaint. Trust that the quiet person in the room will never change the role they've been given. For years, that trust held perfectly, until the day I realized something important. The role they had assigned me wasn't one I had ever actually agreed to. There's a quiet moment that happens in many workplaces, though people rarely talk about it. It's the moment when your job description stops being defined by your title and starts being defined by other people's expectations. For me, that realization arrived gradually, not through a conflict, not through a conversation, just through a growing awareness of how people behaved around me. By my fourth year at the firm, the department had developed a very clear rhythm. When something complicated appeared, it quietly landed on my desk. When a project timeline started unraveling, someone would say, "Maybe Imogen can take a look." When a client's request became confusing or contradictory, I was asked to help organize the communication. None of this was official. No one had written it down anywhere. But the pattern was consistent enough that everyone understood it without needing to say it aloud. I was the stabilizer, the person who smoothed out problems before they reached the surface. At first, I accepted that role without much thought. There was a certain satisfaction in making chaotic things orderly, in watching a messy process become clear and functional. But over time, something else became clear. While I was solving problems, other people were being seen solving them. When a project succeeded, the visible leaders received praise. When a meeting went smoothly, the manager who presented the final plan received credit. The invisible preparation behind those outcomes rarely entered the conversation, and because I had built a reputation for quiet reliability, people assumed I preferred it that way. I noticed it most clearly during performance reviews. Daniel always spoke positively about my work. "Imogen is extremely dependable," he would say. "She keeps the department organized. Everyone trusts her to make sure things don't fall apart." Those comments sounded complimentary, but they were also limiting. Dependable employees keep systems running. They don't usually redesign them. Reliable employees support leadership. They aren't typically seen as leaders themselves. The more consistently I fulfilled the role people expected, the more solid that perception became. And because I rarely pushed against it, no one had a reason to reconsider it, including Daniel. I remember one particular afternoon that clarified the dynamic perfectly. We were preparing materials for a presentation to senior partners. The strategy section had been assembled quickly, and some of the numbers didn't quite align with previous reports. I spent 2 hours quietly reorganizing the data so the story would make sense. When Daniel returned to review the slides, he scanned them for a moment. Then he nodded. "This flows much better," he said. I waited, thinking he might ask how the changes were made, but instead, he closed the laptop and stood up. "Great," he added. "This will land well." Later that afternoon, I watched him present those same slides in the boardroom. The partners listened carefully. A few asked questions. Daniel answered confidently. The presentation ended with approving nods, and once again, the work functioned exactly as intended. On the way out of the room, one of the partners said something I still remember clearly. "Daniel, you've really built a strong operational structure in your team." Daniel smiled in acknowledgement. And for the first time, something inside me shifted slightly. Not anger, not resentment, just a quiet recognition. The system wasn't unfair by accident. It was functioning exactly the way everyone expected it to. Daniel was the leader, the visible strategist, and I was the person who ensured the machinery beneath him ran smoothly. The strange part was that no one had forced that role onto me. It had formed slowly, through habit and silence, through dozens of small moments where I had chosen not to correct the story. But once you notice the role people have assigned you, something changes. You start to see how much of their confidence depends on it, how comfortable they are believing that the structure will never shift, and how surprised they might be if one day the person holding everything together quietly decided to step out of that role. At the time, I didn't act on that thought, I simply noticed it. And noticing, I would later realize, was the first real step toward changing everything. The moment everything began to change didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a confrontation, and no one else in the office noticed it at all. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon in early October, the kind of day where the office hums with steady, predictable activity. Keyboards tapping, phones ringing occasionally, the soft murmur of conversations drifting over cubicle walls. I was reviewing project schedules when an email notification appeared on my screen. It was from Daniel. The subject line read, "Team Update, Upcoming Transition." At first, I assumed it was another internal adjustment, a project reassignment, or perhaps someone moving to a different department. I opened the message without much thought, and there it was, written clearly in the second paragraph. As many of you may have heard, Imogen will be leaving the company next month to pursue other opportunities. Over the next few weeks, we'll begin redistributing some of her responsibilities to ensure a smooth transition. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen, not because the words were confusing. They were actually very clear, but because they described something that had never happened. I hadn't resigned. I hadn't told Daniel I was leaving. In fact, we hadn't even had a conversation remotely resembling that. Yet the message had already been sent to the entire department. By the time I looked up from my laptop, the ripple had already begun. Across the office, people were reading the email. I saw two analysts glance toward my desk with polite curiosity. Someone whispered something to a colleague. Another coworker gave me a small, sympathetic smile. It was the subtle social choreography that happens when people believe someone is about to leave. A mix of mild surprise and immediate adjustment. What struck me most wasn't the rumor itself. It was the speed with which everyone accepted it. No one walked over to ask if it was true. No one sent a quick message to clarify. The announcement had come from a manager, and that was enough. The story had already settled into place. For a few seconds, I considered walking directly to Daniel's office. It would have been easy. A simple correction. "Daniel, I think there's been a misunderstanding." The entire situation could have been resolved in under 2 minutes, but something stopped me. Not anger, something quieter. Curiosity. Because the longer I looked at the email, the more deliberate it felt. Daniel hadn't written it as a question. He hadn't framed it as speculation. He had presented my departure as a confirmed fact, which meant one of two things was true. Either he believed I was leaving, or he needed other people to believe it. That distinction mattered. Instead of reacting immediately, I closed the email and leaned back in my chair. The office continued moving around me. Conversations resumed. Keyboards clicked. Within 20 minutes, the rumor had spread to every corner of the department, and still, no one asked me. That was the moment something shifted inside me. For years, I had corrected small misunderstandings quietly, clarified details, adjusted narratives when they drifted too far from reality. But this time, I didn't. Not because I was afraid to, because I wanted to understand what would happen if I didn't. So I did something that would have surprised the version of me from a few years earlier. I said nothing. I continued working. I answered emails, I updated project schedules, and as the afternoon unfolded, I watched how the story about my departure began to shape the behavior of the entire office. Responsibilities started shifting, meetings were rescheduled, people spoke about the future as if my absence were already certain, all based on a sentence that had never been discussed with me. That silence wasn't confusion, it was a choice. For the first time in years, I decided to stop correcting the narrative. And once you stop correcting a story, you start to see who is invested in keeping it alive. The next morning, the office behaved as if my departure had already been scheduled. It wasn't dramatic. No one gathered around my desk with questions. No one asked when my last day would be. Instead, the changes appeared in small, practical ways. The kind of changes people make when they believe something has already been decided. An analyst who usually asked me about reporting templates emailed someone else instead. A meeting I normally attended suddenly disappeared from my calendar. A project folder I had managed for months was quietly shared with two other coordinators. None of it felt hostile, just efficient. The organization was already adapting to a future where I wasn't part of the structure. And the strange part was how natural it seemed to everyone. I sat at my desk that morning, watching the process unfold with a calm I hadn't expected. If anything, I felt a certain clarity settling in. For years, I had been the person ensuring the system ran smoothly. Now I was watching the system adjust itself, without asking whether the premise behind the adjustment was even true. That observation alone told me something important. The narrative mattered more than the person inside it. Once the story had been introduced, Imogen is leaving next month, people began behaving as if it were already reality, and no one seemed especially interested in verifying it. Around mid-morning, Daniel passed my desk. He paused briefly, the way managers sometimes do when they want to acknowledge something, without turning it into a full conversation. "Morning, Imogen," he said casually. "Morning," I replied. There was a small pause between us, long enough that either of us could have mentioned the email, but neither of us did. Daniel gave a polite nod and continued walking toward the conference rooms. That moment confirmed something I had been quietly wondering since the message arrived. He knew exactly what he had written, and he was waiting to see how I would respond. For years, my pattern had been predictable. If something inaccurate appeared in a report, I corrected it. If a project plan drifted off course, I adjusted it. If a misunderstanding emerged, I clarified it. Daniel had grown accustomed to that pattern, which meant he probably expected the same thing now. Perhaps he thought I would step into his office, explain that there had been a mistake, request that a correction be sent to the team, but instead, I did the one thing that didn't fit the pattern. I let the story continue, not out of passivity, out of intention. Silence, I realized, can serve two very different purposes. Sometimes it's a sign that someone feels powerless to speak. Other times, it's a decision to observe before acting. This time, it was the second. Over the next few days, I began to notice subtle shifts in the way people interacted with me. Some colleagues became slightly more formal, the way people often are when someone is about to leave. Others became unexpectedly friendly. "Let's grab coffee before you go," one coworker said casually in the hallway. "Where are you headed next?" Another asked with polite curiosity. Each time I gave the same calm response. "I haven't decided yet." Technically, that statement was true, but it also allowed the assumption to continue without directly confirming it. What interested me most, though, wasn't my coworkers. It was Daniel, because while the rest of the office had accepted the rumor immediately, Daniel watched me more carefully. Not obviously, just small glances during meetings. A brief pause when I entered a room. The subtle attentiveness of someone waiting for a reaction that hadn't arrived yet. And the longer I remained silent, the more the situation began to evolve in ways I don't think he had fully predicted. Because once people believe someone is leaving, they begin rearranging the future. Responsibilities move, information shifts, assumptions change, and the person who is supposedly leaving suddenly gains a very unusual position inside the organization. They become someone people stop monitoring closely, someone whose actions feel temporary, someone who is already halfway outside the system, which means something very interesting happens. The quiet person everyone assumed would simply disappear suddenly has the freedom to see the entire structure more clearly than ever before. And that's exactly what I began doing. The first thing that changes when people believe you're leaving is what they stop paying attention to. Not intentionally, just gradually. Within a week of Daniel's email, my role inside the department had already begun to blur. Meetings that once required my presence were now considered optional. Some conversations happened without looping me in. At first glance, it might have looked like I was slowly being phased out. But from where I was sitting, something else was happening. For the first time in years, I had space. Space to watch, space to think, space to notice details that had previously been buried under daily problem solving. Most of my colleagues assumed I was quietly wrapping up projects before my departure. And in a sense, I was. But I was also doing something else. I began documenting. Not dramatically, not obsessively, just carefully. I already had a habit of writing things down. That slim black notebook had followed me through every project since my second year at the firm. Normally, it held meeting notes, timeline adjustments, or quick observations about operational gaps. Now it started holding something slightly different. Patterns. Who approved what decisions? Which ideas originated where? how project responsibilities actually flowed through the department. At first glance, these details might have seemed mundane, but over the years of operations work, I had learned something important. Organizations run on narratives. Official reports tell one version of how decisions happen, but the real structure, the one that determines outcomes, lives inside email threads, meeting summaries, and quiet adjustments between departments. Because I had coordinated so many of those moving parts over the years, I already understood the system well. Now I simply begun organizing that understanding more deliberately. I created a private archive on my laptop. Nothing secretive. Everything was based on documents that already existed inside the company's systems: project plans, timeline revisions, and email confirmations. I just arranged them in a way that showed the actual sequence of events: who proposed a change, who approved it, who implemented it, and who later presented it as a managerial initiative. It wasn't about proving wrongdoing. In fact, most of the time, there wasn't any. But the documentation revealed something quietly powerful: a very clear map of how work moved through the department. And the more I organized that map, the more I noticed something else. Many of the systems Daniel was credited with building had originally emerged through my operational adjustments. Not because he had stolen them, but because I had implemented them quietly and allowed the narrative to drift toward leadership. For years, that drift hadn't mattered. Now it did, not because I wanted recognition, but because the rumor about my departure had unintentionally created a new reality. If I were leaving, the systems I maintained would eventually need to stand on their own. And once I looked at them closely, I realized something surprising. Many of them depended far more on my behind-the-scenes work than anyone realized. Client reporting structures, project coordination templates, internal communication pathways. All of them looked stable on the surface. But stability often depends on small adjustments that happen quietly in the background. Adjustments I had been making for years. I didn't break anything. I didn't sabotage a single process. I simply stopped smoothing every rough edge the moment it appeared. Instead, I documented how the system behaved without those constant corrections. What slowed down, what required clarification, which responsibilities did people assume belonged to someone else. And slowly, a picture emerged. Not of a broken organization, but of one that relied heavily on invisible maintenance. Maintenance that most people didn't even know existed. Meanwhile, the rumor about my departure continued spreading through the company. Colleagues from other departments stopped by occasionally. "So where are you headed next?" they would ask casually. "I'm still deciding," I would reply with a small smile. And in a way, that answer was becoming more true every day. Because while the office believed my future was already decided, I was quietly evaluating something much more interesting. Not just where I might go next, but what would happen to the structure they had all taken for granted once the person maintaining it stepped away. The strange part was that none of this required confrontation. No arguments, no dramatic conversations. Just patience, observation, and a growing understanding of exactly how much leverage can exist inside quiet knowledge. Daniel, of course, still believed he understood the situation perfectly. He thought he had introduced a simple narrative: Imogen is leaving next month, but narratives have consequences, and the one he had created was beginning to open doors he hadn't even noticed. Doors that had been closed to me for years. About 3 weeks after Daniel's email, something happened that clarified the entire situation. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen in a meeting room. In fact, no one else in the office even knew it occurred. It started with a routine request from finance. They needed confirmation on a set of operational cost allocations connected to several client projects. Normally, those numbers passed through me before appearing in quarterly summaries, because I understood how the project timelines aligned with staffing and reporting cycles. The request itself wasn't unusual, but when I opened the spreadsheet they had attached, I noticed something interesting. The document included a summary slide prepared for senior leadership, the kind of overview Daniel often presented during quarterly updates. I had seen versions of it before: clean visuals, clear metrics, a narrative about how operational improvements had increased efficiency across several major client accounts. Except this time, the spreadsheet also included the raw data behind those improvements. And when I followed the numbers back through the earlier reports, a pattern emerged almost immediately. Many of the efficiency gains highlighted in the summary were directly tied to operational adjustments I had implemented over the past 3 years. Again, nothing inappropriate. The systems worked exactly as intended, but the way they were being described told a slightly different story. In leadership presentations, the improvements were framed as strategic initiatives introduced by department management. In reality, most of them had started as small operational fixes, a reporting automation I built to prevent recurring delays, a client update template that reduced confusion between departments, a scheduling buffer that prevented last-minute project extensions. Individually, none of these adjustments seemed particularly important, but together, they had created measurable improvements across several large accounts. And because Daniel had been presenting those outcomes as examples of strong departmental leadership, they had quietly elevated his reputation within the firm. I sat there for a long moment looking at the spreadsheet, not feeling angry, not feeling vindicated, just understanding something clearly for the first time. Daniel hadn't created the systems for which he was being credited, but he had become the visible face of their success. And because I had never corrected the narrative, that interpretation had solidified over time. The strange part was that the spreadsheet itself wasn't confidential. Anyone with access to the project archives could trace the same sequence of changes I had just followed. But almost no one ever did. People rarely investigate stories that already make sense to them. The manager improves the department. The department becomes more efficient. Success continues. That narrative was simple, and simplicity is persuasive. But now, because of the rumor about my departure, something had shifted. If I were truly leaving next month, leadership would eventually need to understand exactly how the department's operational structure actually functioned. Not the simplified version, the real one. I closed the spreadsheet and leaned back in my chair. For years, I had maintained the system quietly. I had never needed leverage, because the work itself had been enough. But now, the situation was different. Daniel had introduced a story into the organization without involving me, and that story had consequences. Because if leadership believed I was leaving, they would eventually ask an obvious question. How will the department maintain its operational stability after Imogen's departure? At that point, someone would need to explain the structure behind those systems, who built them, who maintained them, and how they actually worked. The answer to those questions already existed, not in accusations, not in arguments, in documentation. Years of project histories, email confirmations, timeline revisions, all are quietly stored inside the operational records of the company. For the first time since the rumor began, I understood exactly where the leverage was. Not in confrontation, not in exposing anyone, simply in clarity. The truth about how the department functioned had always been available. It had just never been organized in a way that told the full story. Until now. I closed my laptop, picked up my black notebook, and wrote a single sentence at the top of the next page. If they believe I'm leaving, the next question will be, what happens after I go? And once that question is asked, the real structure of the organization becomes impossible to ignore. Once you understand where the leverage is, the next question becomes unavoidable. What do you do with it? For several days after discovering the financial reports, I didn't act immediately. I continued my work the same way I had since Daniel's email went out, calmly, quietly, without correcting the narrative that I would be leaving. But internally, I was considering the possibilities. There were several paths I could take. The first was the simplest. Walk into Daniel's office and clarify everything. Explain that the email had been inaccurate. Ask him to send a correction to the department. Resume my role as it had always been. That option would restore the familiar structure almost instantly, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized something uncomfortable. If I corrected the story now, the system would simply return to the version that had existed before. Daniel would remain the visible architect of the department's success, and I would quietly continue maintaining the operational foundation beneath it. Nothing would fundamentally change. The second option was more confrontational. I could present the documentation I had gathered, the project histories, the operational designs, the records showing how the systems had actually developed. It would certainly attract attention. But attention wasn't the same as resolution. Confrontation often creates a defensive response. People protect their positions. Narratives harden instead of shifting. And I had never been interested in proving someone wrong. The third option was the one that required the most patience. I could allow the situation Daniel had created to continue unfolding. If leadership believed I was leaving, they would eventually begin preparing for that transition. At some point, someone would need a full understanding of the operational structure I maintained. And when that moment arrived, the truth wouldn't need to be argued. It would simply be visible. But there was also a fourth possibility, one that hadn't existed until Daniel introduced the rumor himself. If the organization already believed I was leaving, perhaps I should seriously consider leaving. Not out of frustration, out of clarity. For years, I had worked inside a structure that depended heavily on my contributions but rarely recognized them. Not maliciously, just habitually. Daniel's email had unintentionally revealed something important. The company was comfortable imagining a future where I disappeared quietly, which meant they had never truly considered the value of the systems I maintained. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me curious. What would happen if I stepped outside that structure entirely? Not as a reaction, as a deliberate choice. So I began exploring something I hadn't seriously considered before. Other opportunities, consulting firms in other cities, operational strategy roles where the work I had spent years refining was actually the center of the job, not the invisible support behind someone else's presentation. I updated my professional profile quietly, reached out to a few former colleagues who had moved into leadership roles elsewhere. Nothing dramatic, just conversations, and almost immediately I noticed something interesting. When I described the operational systems I had built over the years, the reporting frameworks, the project coordination structures, the efficiency improvements tied to measurable outcomes, people listened very differently. They didn't see background support. They saw expertise, which meant the decision I had been considering slowly began to change shape. At first, I had asked myself a reactive question. Should I correct the story Daniel created? Now I was asking a much more important one. What future do I actually want? The rumor about my departure had forced the entire department to imagine a version of events where I was already gone. But that didn't mean the story had to be false. Sometimes the most irreversible decision isn't confrontation. It's simply choosing not to return to the role everyone expects you to keep playing. And once I realized that, the path forward became much clearer. Once the decision became clear in my mind, everything that followed happened very quietly. There were no dramatic changes in my daily routine. I still arrived at the office each morning, opened my laptop, and worked through the same projects everyone expected me to finish before my supposed departure. From the outside, nothing looked different, but behind the scenes, small preparations were beginning. I scheduled a few private calls during lunch hours with contacts from other firms. People I had worked with years earlier, former colleagues who now held operational leadership roles in different organizations. The conversations were straightforward. I described the systems I had built, the reporting frameworks, the scheduling models, and the coordination structures that had reduced delays across multiple departments. I explained how those systems connected strategy with day-to-day execution, and for the first time in years, I watched people respond to that work as the main subject, not the background support. Within 2 weeks, 2 companies had asked if I would consider formal interviews. Meanwhile, back at the office, the story Daniel had introduced continued shaping everyone's expectations. Responsibilities were still shifting slowly away from me. New coordinators were being added to project folders. People spoke about after-image and leaves as if it were already part of the calendar. And because of that assumption, something unexpected happened. No one paid close attention to what I was doing anymore. Not in a suspicious way. Simply, in a relaxed way, people behave around someone they believe is temporary, which gave me the space to complete the final piece of preparation. I organized the documentation I had been building for weeks. Clear operational map of how the department's systems actually function, project flows, decision chains, reporting structures, not as an accusation, just as clarity. Because once I left, those systems would need to be understood by someone else. The strange thing was that none of this felt like revenge. It felt orderly, like closing a long chapter properly. By the time the first interview invitation arrived in my inbox, the office was already behaving as if my exit was inevitable. Daniel believed he had started a rumor that placed me one step outside the organization. What he didn't realize was that the space he created was exactly what I needed to move forward without resistance. The first signs appeared quietly. At first, no one connected them to me. A project report arrived 2 hours later than usual because two departments were waiting for each other to confirm the final numbers. A client email sat unanswered longer than expected because no one was quite sure who was responsible for coordinating the response. Nothing serious, just small delays, the kind that normally disappeared before anyone noticed them. Except this time, they didn't. Over the years, I had developed a habit of correcting those tiny misalignments almost automatically. If a timeline didn't quite fit, I adjusted it. If communication between teams became unclear, I clarified it before it turned into confusion. Now, because everyone believed I was already halfway out the door, those adjustments simply didn't happen as quickly. I wasn't withholding anything. I was still doing my work. But I had stopped quietly absorbing every operational gap the moment it appeared. Instead, the system began revealing its natural shape. Meetings ran slightly longer while people figured out who owned which tasks. Emails circulated through 2 or 3 people before reaching the right person. Once or twice, Daniel stepped into conversations that normally never reached his level simply because no one had resolved them earlier. None of it looked dramatic, but the rhythm of the department began to change. The smooth flow people had taken for granted became slightly uneven. What interested me most was how people interpreted it. No one blamed Daniel, no one blamed the department. Instead, the explanation everyone seemed most comfortable with was the simplest one. Well, things are a bit messy because Imogen's leaving. I heard that sentence twice in the same week, both times spoken casually, like a weather observation. And in a way, they were right. The department was adjusting to the idea of my absence. But the real consequence wasn't the delays themselves. It was the slow realization that many small pieces of the system had quietly depended on someone they had assumed was easily replaceable. Meanwhile, Daniel began watching the situation more closely. Not panicked, just attentive. Because the structure he believed he understood was starting to behave slightly differently than expected. And the strange part was this. The department still believed the problem would disappear once the transition was complete. They thought the instability was temporary. They assumed that after I left, everything would settle again. What they didn't realize yet was that the stability they remembered had never existed on its own. It had always been maintained, quietly, every single day. About a week later, the shift became impossible to ignore. It still wasn't a crisis. No project collapsed. No client complained loudly. But the quiet inefficiencies that had been appearing around the department were beginning to accumulate. Deadlines were still being met, just with more last-minute effort. Internal emails grew longer as people clarified details that previously seemed obvious. Small coordination issues kept reaching Daniel's desk, issues that normally resolved themselves somewhere lower in the process. For the first time in years, Daniel started asking more questions. Who's managing the reporting sequence for the Baxter account? Why are the client updates arriving out of order? Did we change the project template? The answers were always the same. No, nothing changed. And technically, that was true. Nothing in the system had been altered. But something had changed. The quiet maintenance that kept the structure running smoothly was no longer happening automatically. One afternoon, Daniel finally stopped by my desk again. This time, he didn't move on immediately. "How are things going with your transition?" he asked. His tone was neutral, but there was a hint of uncertainty behind the question. "Everything's organized," I said calmly. "Documentation is up to date." He nodded slowly. "That's good," he said. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something else. Perhaps ask about the operational files, or clarify the timeline of my departure. But he didn't. Instead, he thanked me briefly and walked away. Watching him return to his office, I realized something important. Daniel still believed the situation was temporary. He assumed that once the transition finished, once someone else absorbed my responsibilities, the department would return to its usual rhythm. What he hadn't fully understood yet was that operational systems don't maintain themselves just because they exist. They require attention, context, memory, years of small adjustments that rarely appear in official documentation. And by the time an organization realizes how much of that knowledge lives inside one person, it's usually much harder to recreate than anyone expected. Meanwhile, my interviews had quietly progressed. One company had already scheduled a final conversation with its leadership team, which meant the story the office had been repeating for weeks was about to become something slightly different. Not a rumor, a decision. and by the time Daniel understood the difference, it would already be far too late to change the version of events he had started. The conversation with Daniel finally happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon. He asked if I had a few minutes and gestured toward his office. His tone was calm, but by then I could sense the shift in his attention. The small operational issues in the department had clearly begun to reach him more often. We sat across from each other at the small meeting table near the window. For a moment, he reviewed a few notes on his laptop before looking up. "I've been meaning to check in," he said. "About your transition. Do you have a confirmed timeline yet?" The question hung in the air for a second. Until that moment, neither of us had ever directly acknowledged the email he had sent weeks earlier. "I do," I said evenly. He nodded, waiting. "I've accepted a position with another firm," I continued. "My last day here will be at the end of the month." Daniel leaned back slightly, absorbing the information. "I see," he said after a pause. There was no anger in the room, no raised voices, just a quiet recalculation happening behind his expression. "I wish we'd had a chance to discuss this earlier," he added. For a moment, I considered pointing out the obvious, that the original announcement hadn't exactly come from me. But the moment didn't require correction anymore. "The documentation for the operational systems is complete," I said instead. "Everything the team needs is in the shared folders." Daniel nodded again. "That will help," he said. We sat in silence for a few seconds after that. The kind of silence that arrives when two people realize the situation has already moved beyond negotiation. Finally, he stood and extended his hand. "Well," he said quietly, "I wish you the best with the new role." "Thank you," I replied. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. No confrontation, no explanations, just two people acknowledging a decision that had already become irreversible. And in a strange way, Daniel had been right about one thing from the beginning. I was leaving next month. The only difference was, the story had ended exactly the way he started it. My last weeks at the firm passed quietly. There were farewell coffees, polite conversations in the hallway, and the usual mix of curiosity and encouragement people offer when someone moves on. "Keep in touch. Let us know how the new role goes." Most of my colleagues were sincere. Many of them had worked beside me for years, and I had no reason to leave with bitterness. The truth was simpler than that. The structure I had outgrown wasn't malicious. It was just comfortable. Comfortable for the people who benefited from it, and familiar to the person who had been quietly maintaining it. My new role, by contrast, felt very different from the beginning. On my first day, the conversation wasn't about supporting someone else's strategy. It was the strategy. The leadership team wanted to understand how operational systems could shape the success of their projects. They asked detailed questions about the frameworks I had built in my previous role, the same systems that had once lived quietly in the background. For the first time in years, the work I cared about most wasn't invisible. It was central. That shift didn't feel like a victory. It felt like alignment. I hadn't changed who I was. I was still the same person who noticed patterns, organized complexity, and believed that strong systems make everything else possible. The only difference was that I had stepped into an environment where that perspective wasn't mistaken for quiet support. It was recognized as leadership. And looking back now, I understand something I didn't fully see back then. The problem was never that people underestimated me. The real problem was that I had stayed inside a structure where underestimation had become normal. Once I stepped outside of it, the difference was surprisingly simple. I didn't need to prove anything. I just needed to be somewhere that actually saw the value of what I had already been doing all along. When people hear this story, they often expect a dramatic ending, a confrontation, an apology, a moment where someone finally realizes they were wrong. But that isn't what happened. Daniel didn't call me months later with regret. The company didn't suddenly discover everything I had done and try to bring me back. Life rarely wraps itself into neat conclusions like that. Instead, the ending was much quieter. I left. The department continued, and everyone slowly adjusted to the version of reality that followed. But the lesson I carried with me was surprisingly simple. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't proving someone wrong. It's stepping out of the role they assumed you would always accept. For years, people saw me as dependable, supportive, and quiet. None of those things was untrue. The problem was that those qualities had quietly confined me to a position where my work was invisible. Once I recognized that, the solution didn't require conflict. It just required movement. not away from people, but toward a place where my contribution was actually visible. Looking back now, I don't think Daniel intended to push me out. But in a strange way, the rumor he started forced me to ask a question I might have ignored for years. Was I staying because the role was right for me, or because everyone expected me to stay? And sometimes, the moment you ask that question honestly, your next step becomes very clear. So, I'm curious about something. Have you ever realized that people had quietly assigned you a role in your life or career when you never actually agreed to?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.